آزادی بیان
言论自由
free speech.
Tim Berners-Lee, you will see in our first principle, we say that all human beings must be not just free, but also able to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas. That's something added to the classic formulation of Article 19. Do you believe that internet access is, in that sense, a universal human right?
Well, I think I agree with what Vince said, is that to talk about the internet specifically in human rights is inappropriate because it's the sort of technology of our time. But nowadays, effectively, for people in the street, you talk about it as internet access being a human right, but we have to phrase it without using the word internet. Certainly, as the net gets more and more powerful, as more and more things are on the web, the gap between those who do have it and those who don't have it becomes larger. And so I think then we have a duty to help people bridge that gap as fast as possible. And one of the ways we express that duty is by saying this thing is a right.
Right. But you would agree with the refinement that Vince Cerf made on that, which is it's not a first-order human right in itself, like the right to life, or indeed the right to freedom of expression.
But
it's a vital means to that end.
Vince Cerf said, don't talk about the internet itself, because that is just the IP technology. There could be another network technology which comes along afterwards. What you're talking about is being a member of a full member of, if you like, of the information society, using whatever technology is current, using the latest technology. And I think when you look at that, in fact, in a way, it's not, when you look at the United Nations Article 19 talks about being able to receive information and impart information, and at various points in the Declaration. But also, if you think of the way you are able to work on the web, is that really summed up by just imparting information and receiving information? I think there are other things. So, for example, when you search for something, when you search the web, if you want to know whether somebody's had an idea before or thought of a word before, you can just search for the web, immediately being able to get either the fact that nobody has yet thought of that word, or be able to get, yes, they thought of the word, and this is what humanity in general thinks about it.
Yeah,
the use of a powerful service is more than, I think, than just receiving information.
Well, indeed. I mean, of course, the formulation that we now have is seek, receive, and impart. And one thing to have emerged from our research is the vital importance, particularly in developing or less free countries, of freedom of information, not just of expression. But could I add a question on, because you are one of the great advocates of the open web and of net neutrality. Now, of course, much of the growth at the moment is on mobile, and it seems in the developing world. And it seems to me that the norm of net neutrality is nothing like as well established on mobile as it is on the internet classically conceived.
There is, well, certainly this sort of infamous discussion which was between a couple of large companies in America, has rather shaken net neutrality on mobile. But I think also a lot of people realize a couple of things. One is that really, to your computer or your phone, whether you are getting internet through a wired connection or through a mobile, or whether it's a wired connection that actually later on goes through a mobile connection, or a mobile connection that actually later on goes through a wired connection, all these combinations of wireless and wired transmission are absolutely immaterial to the way you use it and the rights that you have on it. There were some arguments made that, well, mobile is different because there's particularly limited bandwidth on mobile. Well, I don't think so. I think mobile may be different in that the incumbent providers of devices are more used to having more control over their users, so they may be more reluctant to allow people to access the open internet. But I feel that certainly it is a nonsense to say that the rights of a human being depend on the particular technology they're using to connect today, at this moment, to the internet, as opposed to in 5 minutes' time when the device has switched to a different sort of network.
But I mean, de facto, at the moment, it is the case that, you or I sitting in Oxford or Boston accessing google.com at the tap of a button have a far greater access than people in Africa trying to access stuff through mobile, both because of the technology, but also because of the mobile operators.
Well, I suppose when you bring up Africa, that brings up the other part of it. If you are you really, when lots of people can only access on mobile devices, for that very large majority of the population at the moment, which is currently mostly disenfranchised completely, but later will come on only with mobile, when a lot of us have got a hope that actually mobile technology, mobile data will actually allow countries to leapfrog and get onto the web very much more quickly than the developed world did, then surely it's very ironic for rights of those people, of the people who generally are poorer, are disenfranchised already, to be reduced. So I think there is a strong irony there, and in a way, a use for protecting the rights on mobile even more strongly than the rights for the wired connections used by the privileged.
You have, however, been, if I read you right, like Jonathan Citrin and others, a critic of the so-called closed rather than open devices, for example, Apple.
Well, I'm not going to talk about the individual manufacturers here because I'm director of a vendor-neutral consortium, so I typically don't do that sort of thing. Certainly, when you use the word open, it's used in lots of different ways. So I've been, ever since the start of the web is based on standards. So a very important thing is open standards.
Right.
So you can judge a company on to what the extent to which it uses open standards. Will it interoperate with other devices, no matter who much they are? So there's open in the sense of open standards. Then there's open in the sense of open markets. There's open different systems can be open. So yes, some people complain that some devices have a limited market. You can only buy applications from one place, or they have to go through a particular market, or you can only buy songs from one place, for example. Yes, I am in general in favor of the open market, and of course I'm also in favor of things being available open source. Although I believe in a good competition between open source and proprietary software.
Now, with apologies for a very sweeping question, but you'll see the point of it. In general terms, do you think the trend is towards a more open web, all in all? Because many have argued that there is a trend towards a certain closing down, including the emergence of quasi-monopolies, as Tim Wu has argued.
Well, I think both trends are accelerating, if you like. I think, yes, there are always the threats from large companies. They will always be there, because they will always argue that it's in their shareholder interest to achieve an unreasonable leverage to be able to, for example, get hold of a complete vertical market and be able to control everything, to be from the phone, the internet connection, the search engine, and the way you buy your shoes. So that has always been a goal to be able to try and establish to complete control over the consumer has been a goal of large companies. But in general, a mixture, I suppose, of regulation and just consumer outcry and consumer common sense have fought back. I think, but there are a lot of current threats at the moment. There have been some recent threats also in the ways from governments. But at the same time,
for example, from governments.
But at the same time, you asked about whether the trend is in that direction. I think there is more of a human awareness. If you talk to people in the street, they would not have been aware of the issue of their internet being turned off by a government before the Mubarak regime disconnected Egypt from the rest of the world. And then people in Egypt and outside Egypt suddenly asked, wait a moment, who's got the connection? Who's got the switch? And so I think that the awareness, and I think that things like this debate, which you're doing, are really important, and getting everybody talking about it, because we'll need a very large amount of mobilization. I think sort of academics and people on the street in general should be leaning on politicians to get them to especially say where they stand on this issue. We've seen, for example, in Holland, because one ISP, I understand, started slowing down voice over internet packets because they didn't want them to compete with the telephone service. That led to legislation which I gather has now gone through. So net neutrality is now the law in Holland.
I mean, of course, that's about states and governments. But what about the restrictions imposed by private powers? Our second principle talks about private powers, the Googles and Facebooks and Twitters, and of course Baidu's and others. Are you concerned about some of their practices? I mean, not being necessarily specific, and in particular about the problem of privacy?
Well, privacy is part of it. I think that spying is one part of it. Yes, I mentioned that the legislation in Holland, which that was produced because an ISP had broken the rules. So one part of it, one side is filtering, and the other side is spying. In both cases, we have problems with large companies as well as governments. It depends a bit on which country you're in, which one is most worrying. But if you like, the most worrying thing overall is that actually you end up with the two working together.
Indeed.
So you end up with a telecom monopoly, which is a monopoly allowed by government, which has very strong connections with the government, so that when the government wants to disconnect the country from the internet, it actually knows who to go to, and they know how to do it. Or you get a law which makes it required for ISPs to spy and to track internet traffic. And then you end up with this repository of very, very dangerous, potentially damaging information about individuals stored all over the place. And then you have then the government either sort of fairly makes a subpoena for the information, or the intelligence services, rather under the cover, just go and acquire it.
Well, like a FISA Act in the US, of course, which is secret.
So in general, so the combination of government, it tends to end up being a combination of both. And of course, you need a combination of both to fight crime. So defining the line here is really important and has to be done quite carefully, because we do want to give governments the power to fight serious crime. We do want them to be able to find and defeat terrorists before the terrorist acts happen. But on the other hand, if this is done by making ISPs regularly report information about all individuals, then I've described this as dynamite, this information. If you imagine that you've got a machine somewhere in the world which has got all the information about a particular house, and the websites that those people have been to, the communications that the people have had, but even just the websites, just things like the diseases that the people in that house have been worried about and may have looked up, with never mind whether they did for their own behalf or on behalf of somebody else. But you've got all this information which will clearly demonstrate, for example, whether the people in that house are heterosexual or homosexual from the sorts of websites they go to. Then you've got this potentially about people in the military. You've got this information about people in the government. So maybe the government should think first, what happens when somebody hacks into that? And then suddenly the whole nation is at the knees of blackmailers. Then you've got people in responsible positions who could be approached. But by the way, we've read your profile. Do you want us to talk about it in the public, or would you like to help us make sure that these particular people get off, that this legislation does not go through? So in a way, to have that information around is dynamite. Somebody suggested, it's interesting, that the deep packet inspection equipment, which is used which is quite sophisticated, and is used for actually looking at the traffic to somebody's site and figuring out what's going to somebody's house, and figuring out which websites they're going to. That deep packet inspection is made by the people we think of as developed countries, and so maybe the question is, should that be considered a munition? Should it be controlled? It's at least a good thought experiment. Should it be controlled like a weapon of mass destruction? Because in fact, when it's used by an oppressive regime, it can be used to put thousands of people to immediately expose the web of social graph of people who are opposed to the regime and put them all in jail or kill them.
I think pointing to the nexus of the combination of public and private power as being, in a way, the most dangerous, or both the most powerful and most dangerous point is a very interesting one. That's the dark side, and it could be very dark. Let's look at the bright side. The upside. What's the, as it were, best case out of this, out of these developments in terms of open access? You just now have something called, I believe, the Open Data Institute. What's the best case in terms of our having the world's knowledge at our fingertips?
The best case is that these rights are established, and so people can use the internet. They can look up when they have a lump, whether it's cancer, without thinking that their there's somebody looking over their shoulder, and their insurance rates will go up. So the best case is that there's no spying under very strictly controlled circumstances, and no filtering, so that if people want to control what their children see, they do it by running software on their own computer rather than having it banned.
So you mean no filtering at the ISP level?
No filtering at the ISP level for the sake of pornography, but just because you can set up filtering if you want to filter people and want to prevent children, for example, access from pornographic sites as a parent, then you have the right to do that, and you can buy all kinds of different software which you can run on the computer, which will block the child and put you in control of that. So I think that's sort of many years ago, I think that we generally established that was the way that sort of blocking should work. So you've got a generally open internet, and so this is what we'll see, of course, is as we've seen, this huge amount of creativity about people building new websites, building new ways of forms of working together on the web will happen. We'll see a lot of, hopefully, in an ideal world, a lot of governments will follow the start that the UK has made, and the UK will go on putting much more data on the web, so that there'll be lots of understanding about what's actually happening in this, what the state of a country really is, from data journalists and people who are capable of looking at the data. There'll be a lot more transparency. There'll be an understanding of where spending is going. Increased transparency on the part of governments through putting spending data on the web will then lead to dramatic reductions, hopefully, in corruption in some of the countries where it's a serious problem at the moment. And when the corruption drops, then the response will be much greater investment in the country as a whole.
Just tell us very briefly about the Open Data Institute.
The Open Data Institute, I want to talk to you about democracy as well. Let's talk about the Open Data
We'll come to democracy, yeah.
So the Open Data Institute is just being set up in the UK. It's bringing together academics and industry, trying to increase through training the number of people who understand how to do things with open data. The linked data technology, which makes open data much more powerful, much more powerful because it allows you to connect different data together. That's another something that promote, make tools for, and teach more people how to use. In general, if you like, the Open Data Institute in the UK, it's a very important backing to the whole open data idea. It's to provide support for those who are putting data out there, support for those who are analyzing the data, and really a catalyst for making the whole open data story work.
Some critics say that we're being smothered with data, that there's just almost too much minute detail coming from government departments, that as we're beginning so many trees we can't see the wood.
Well, the problem of seeing the wood for the trees is one that's been out there actually on the web all the time. And I get people on one side saying, help, 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 I can't see the wood for the trees, or there's so much junk out there, how do I find out what's good? And on the other side, I see people saying, help, 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 I'm a journalist, wherever, whoever, what's going to happen to me, whoever will need a journalist in the future. And I think I'd put these together and say, obviously, the whole role of journalists and people who review all the information out there, check its sources, and analyze it, and look for trends in it. All those things are very, very important on the web. So the role, that the profession of journalism, if you like, is very, very important. It takes a different form. It won't involve felling so many trees, but its existence is in a way part of the answer to that first cry about too much data.
So that's a new, as it were, a new job for journalism.
Absolutely, and they should learn to become data journalists. Yes.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Just on the academic side, of course, a very lively debate about Elsevier and open access journals. Where do you stand on that?
I think that's a really interesting thing. I think that scholarly publication, I tend to like the model where you pay when you publish, and people read for free. I think it might be interesting to see a market where there are both sorts of journal. Yes, but I feel that getting open access is a really important step. I also think that finding ways of paying journalists and reviewers and people who organize all this, the structure is important. And I think we're going to have to see that also. We're going to have to look at, the whole similar but different question for how do we pay people to create blockbuster movies? How do we pay people to create small independent films? How do we pay people to create beautiful music? Those things are all up in the air. One of the interesting things is we may see new payment protocols being devised so that on my browser I've got tools, buttons I can use in order to pay people, maybe just a few pennies at a time as I read a blog or something. That could be a source of
Can I push you on that? Because I remember Bill Gates at Davos about 3 years ago saying he thought micropayments were the future. But it's amazing how resistant people are to paying, even if it's a very small payment.
Well, people were resistant to paying money for music, but now, but then when one particular market came along and make it really, really, really easy, then I think people are much less resistant. I think it's a question. It's a very tricky balance. Yes, I thought at WTC we talked about standards for micropayment years ago. Really, when the consortium was in its early days in the 90s, we thought the micropayments would be a really important thing then. Obviously, it was naturally occur to be as the web spread to be able to pay people for content. It's a question of whether you've got all the financial infrastructure, whether you've got the trust with the financial infrastructure, and then when you've got a really good user interface design, which gives people the right amount of control and the right amount of visibility of what's going on, but with being as unintrusive as possible.
Now, Tim, can I press you, because you mentioned democracy, can I press you, because we've got a sort of pushback in the course of our debate with a lot of people, including some of our own students from different countries, saying, hey, but look, all these sort of nice Western liberal norms, they only end up empowering the powerful, making the powerful more powerful, strengthening the established hierarchies. How would you answer them?
Well, I think that was a bit of a generalization. So I suppose, so my general answer is on the net, as of, we do need our social structures. If you look at places like Wikipedia, it started off with a utopian social structure and it rapidly had to develop a sort of meritocracy. Mm-hmm. We see very many web systems designing meritocracies. Some of them design little sort of nests of interlocking cliques. Some people, so different websites have completely different ways of deciding who's in and who's out, of maybe sometimes associating reputation. And some systems, like the auction systems, reputation is actually very, very key. Other systems, it's not as question of who you know, and they don't work so reputation-wise. So basically, people are reinventing different social systems. They are inventing new social systems when it comes to education, which we hope the web will help, when it comes to health, and when it comes to governance and democracy. So, yeah, there are some people on the web who run oppressive regimes, and where really they are not very much in favor of democracy spreading. But in general, out there, the trend is towards slowly, bit by bit, more and more democracy.
Can I push you on that? Because, of course, if you look at the distribution on the web, it is, in general, a power law curve, isn't it? There are the very few reaching the very many, and the very many reaching the very few. I think that's...
when you look at the zip, if you look at the zip law of then one of the so yes, you have a few leading things, and you have a thick middle and a long tail, and the thickness of the middle is very important as well as the length of the tail.
Yes.
So, in other words, it's important that there are lots of places you can go for information which are not the most popular.
But can I pick you up on that, because it's such a crucial point, and it's such an important phrase, the thick middle,
yes.
middle, because I mean, as in politics, as in society, as in so many things, as in literature, that's actually crucial to have the thick middle. So, can you say a bit more about how you get the thick middle in different fields, in knowledge provision, in healthcare, in whatever it may be?
Well, I think what happens in general on the net, when web scientists look at the web and they study it and they look at they model what's happening and they look at different phenomena, you find that you keep getting this power law, which does have a thick middle, does have a long tail. It keeps turning out when you have this sort of organic mass of people talking together, and you could talk to mathematicians about various hypotheses, about models, about why you get these power laws. But in general, it seems when you have an organic mass, then you tend to get the power law coming out. And when you have a mass of competing companies, you tend to get one leading, and you tend to get other ones competing fairly closely. Every now and again, you can get a flip into a mode where you don't have the organic mass, where somebody manages to establish a hierarchy, somebody manages to lock out the others. On the internet, they can do that in various different... They can do it commercially.
Search would be a good example, wouldn't it?
Sorry?
Search would be a good example.
Search might be an example, or...
Where one company is so far ahead that, not to use Google for a week is like wearing an ill-fitting pair of shoes all week.
Well, of course, again, we're talking about one particular company, but over another. But in general, I think everybody just has to be aware that when a company is very successful and achieves a monopoly, there are huge downsides.
Right.
And you can look back at how when in countries where there was only one telecom provider and only one person designing telephones, really the telephones were not very. There wasn't a lot of creativity.
Bell, AT&T,
or the General Post Office in the UK, for that matter. So and at AOL, when AOL was an online provider which had a very strong monopoly there, but for a while trying to compete with the open web, and then after a while realizing that it just couldn't, and it had to be part of it. rather than be, the only access to it or the only content on it. So I think that you get this lack of innovation, which comes with a monopoly at any level of the stack. But I think that also it's amazing how people worried about when the web started. People were more or less despaired about the open web because Netscape was completely dominant, and they worried about it. So one moment then one day they started worrying about Microsoft, and then because Microsoft was suddenly completely dominant, and then they were worried about Microsoft, and then one moment they woke up with somebody else completely dominant, and it's happened very quickly. People were worried that Gopher was dominant, and then they woke up. Then there was the World Wide Web suddenly started ticking off. So I think that is every now and again so we do need an antitrust laws. We do need to make sure that because there are two stable states for society. There's the long tail state, and there's the completely dominated by one force, and that can be either a government or a company or both. And we have to make sure that we stay in the long tail. In the power law.
If I may, two last questions. One is, we have some interesting material on the site about the problem of language bubbles. That in a sense, the greatest frontiers on the web are no longer the state frontiers, but they're the language frontiers. That the English speakers talk to the English speakers, the Chinese speakers to the Chinese speakers. Now you have developed something called the Semantic Web. Could you tell us a bit about that and whether that also helps to overcome the problem of language bubbles?
Well, it does in some ways, but not completely. It doesn't allow people to suddenly talk as with a sort of Douglas Adams Babelfish area. But it does. But one of the nice things about data, if you put spending data out there, when you create an ontology of terms for what things are being spent on, or for just terms like sort of total and and amount and date and things like that. Those terms are generally international standards, and the software in different countries and for servicing people with speaking different languages can be driven can have glossaries. And in general, the RDF technology, the semantic web technology, does encourage you when you make an ontology of terms to put labels on the terms in multiple languages. So then automatically, when somebody's looking at this data with a client on a different server than using a different language, then they automatically bridge the language barrier. Yes, language is a barrier, but in a way, culture is a barrier. So you can have people who speak the same language, but, for example, the Catholics and the Protestants in Northern Ireland, yes, they spoke the same language, principally, but they may not speak to each other at all. Or to a certain extent, unfortunately, in the United States, when you look at the Democrat and the Republicans,
blue and red,
they just they don't link each other to each other's blogs. They're worlds apart. They have very different ways of using words. They have very different ways of just analyzing situations. They have different worldviews, different world models, and there's very little interoperability between them, even though they use the same language. So what's interesting are the cultural barriers. So the interesting question is, when you go online, are you actually on any given day bridging a cultural barrier? One of the things I suggested in this light, I suggested at the last web conference, is that the idea of a stretch friend, that our software tends to suggest to us friends which are mathematically calculated to be very close. They're friends of friends already, or they're people who've read the same papers or been to the same conferences. And so if we accept all those friends suggested by the system, we will make our knot of friends more and more knotty until we just until when we go to a party,
KNOT.
KNOT, yes. Yeah. When we go to a party, it's great, but we don't really actually meet anybody new. It's great because we meet all the same people, whoever's party we go to, because we're all of the friends which we could have met, we've already decided to formally make into our proper friends. So so a stretch friend is, the system could throw up every now and again and say, well, Timothy, now you've talked to all these people to make these interviews, and that's all very well, but now I want you to go and interview somebody who's not online at all, just isn't in your book, isn't in your address book, they are academic like you, but they only study poetry, and they're and they're of a different religion, or maybe they're very very similar to you, but they are of a different religion, or they're very similar to you, but they speak Chinese. So we'd like you to bridge the Chinese barrier. You're going to have to learn some Chinese. Maybe learning another language is a big stretch, but just learning, maybe for example, an engineer who's used to a situation which has been very dominated by men, make the point of going to talk to a woman engineer in your field. To some, maybe if you've been used to go and talk to a Muslim, go and talk to somebody who differs by one one dimension. So I think when we look at the web, the question is it helping us, individual people dedicated to humanity as a whole? So are they stretching to understand why the people the other side of the border think that they can move into this town and occupy it, when in fact I know you've been living there for so long? What does it take to go and understand their mentality? What does it take to understand the mentality of the person whose house you're just about to have knocked down to have a house built for you? That it's these division. Those are the divisions which are causing the stopping us.
Just quickly on that, because I think the stretch friend is a fantastic idea. But of course, there is the quite often heard argument from Cass Sunstein and others that there's also the opposite tendency on the web, the closing in, the information cocoon, talking only to the like-minded.
Yes. Well, people worry. They've always worried about that. The information cocoon, the filter bubble, from the word go. When I was talking about how the French were worried about American culture coming down the internet and swamping them. And I gave a talk at a conference, and I came back to the hotel, in the US hotel, and there was a USA Today, and we flipped over the front page of USA Today was a story about the French farmer putting a chain around a new McDonald's that had just been built and towing it away into his field, because the McDonald's represented the American culture. And you imagine that the vapor pressure of the American culture on one side and of the Louvre on the other side, fighting over who's the hearts and minds of the French. So there's always been that worry about silos. And there's also been the worry about the McDonald's culture would end up, the lowest common denominator would end up permeating everywhere. So you've got these, and those two, they're both worries, and they're both, in a way, one is the flip side to the other. And so you need to keep the people who are worried about the two sides in touch with each other. And the solution, I think, is that there is a balance. Science suggests to us that maybe the power, when we're looking at, when things are in the power law, maybe that's a sweet spot. So maybe we should engineer it to get people into the power law. But in general, right now, when you look at the power law, there is much too much emphasis at there's much too much of a peak at the national level, and at the language level, as you say. And there's not enough there's a de-emphasis at the international level. So we need to get people thinking more global, bridging the national and the language barriers. And I think we need to design websites to do that. We need to design systems to do that. Then we need to put it on your individual agenda as a human being, and point out that because the web allows you now to cross these boundaries and to talk to somebody who's in a very different culture to you, stop jumping up and down and celebrating the fact that it allows you to do it, but it allows you to do it, but actually spend some time actually doing it.
Do you think that for the foreseeable future, this is in a sense as good as it gets in terms of the interactive experience? A good real-time picture of each other, good real-time audio?
No, I don't think so. I'm looking at you on quite a small screen. I know that this would work better if you were life-size. So I suppose that's partly because we've been discussing the things which I might be reading at the same time. But in general, I think we will move to building our rooms so that we've got room for quite a large screen at the end of the table, so people can be sitting around the table with much more of a feeling of being the same size as everybody else. The placement of voice, so that when you have speakers around the room, so when you're looking at a screen, the voice comes from the right place. There's a lot of things. So a lot of things which we know how to do, but we just haven't implemented them in cases. Will make it even better. The resolution will continue to go up. Maybe we also we can go stereo. So no, I think that this talking on this is the sort of thing which we'll do on our phones in the future, maybe. But when we talk office to office, then I hope it'll be much more. It'll seem much more. You'll feel much more like you're in my office, and I'll feel much more like I'm in your office. If you're looking at things which will enhance things in the future, the big question in my mind is: will machine translation get there?
Right.
Will it get to the point where at least when we have a typed conversation, or we did actually when the Google Translate API was open, when you could access it from a program, then Ralph Swick here actually wrote a version of the chat program we use, which would translate so that everybody could talk in their own native language and see everybody else's thing in their own native language.
How did it work?
So that, well, then he got it working, and then Google took away the ability to be able to call their translation system as a service.
Yes.
So that's a shame.